Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the constitutions, and it seems like a contradiction in terms, but the constitutions of tyrannical states. We could be talking about North Korea or the Soviet Union, Chairman Mao's China, Pol Pot's Cambodia, the East German Communist Democratic Republic before 1991, and so on. So there's quite a few to choose from. So let's have a look at these constitutions. Now, the Constitution is, as in most places, is I suppose part aspirational, particularly in the preamble. If you look at, say, the United States Constitution. There's vague references, the pursuit of happiness, things like that. I mean, what's that? Is there a definition? Whose happiness? How happy? Little happy, big happy? So that these are broad sort of aspirational goals that generally set out the overall or broader strategic intention or purpose of government. Now, where it's supposed to be a document to represent where the government serves the people, then the preservation of the people's freedoms, things like that are relevant. And you see this in the US Constitution, the amendment, particularly areas like the amendments. The government shall make no laws that will impede freedom of speech, for example, or freedom of religion, and things like that. So these are good goals to I believe good goals to have. The fine micro detail of how these things should be enforced and implemented, that's a separate issue again, and the laws at the micro level, clearly defining what a breaking of the law is, and then clearly prescribing penalties and legal procedures and so on. And there are things that we take for granted now, such as the presumption of innocence, that in many countries is considered, in the United States, Britain, Australia, once was anyway, that the basic bedrock or part of the bedrock of the legal system, that anyone can accuse you of anything they want, but they have to go into a court of law, an independent judge in a court of law, often a jury, and they have to prove it beyond reasonable doubt. And the view that it's better that guilty men go free rather than innocent men be incarcerated. Now, what we're seeing today is or what we see rather in tyrannical regimes, is that the cooperation of the people or the citizenry is viewed as being unlikely, if not difficult to achieve or impossible to achieve. Therefore, it must be imposed through brute force. And this is the case really with any tyrannical system and anything that wants to enforce absolute conformity on the citizenry. Now, when we look at, say, the Soviet Union or again, others, North Korea, China, and that sort of thing, the government seized power through revolution and armed revolution, and so the idea of killing people to get what you want was always considered as acceptable. And also in these countries, the Soviet Union as an example, they went through a civil war as well, which tended to cause death and murder and assassinations as being very much part of the process of how you get and maintain power. Now, I guess as you're looking at any constitution that doesn't defend the freedoms of the individual means that the government intends to coerce the population through whatever means, whether it be arbitrary arrest, imprisonment, killing them, or interrogating them, beating them half to death, whatever. But intends to exercise its control through various means, and also that the government says the decision-making groups is we are the sole interpreters of the ideology that governs us, and we are not ourselves accountable to the law. The law is to make you accountable, not for us. Now, if we look at, say, the Soviet constitution, it talks about socialism and the socialist ideal and how to achieve a society where there's equal outcomes for everybody. And they talk a pretty good fight, I guess, insincere though it may be, but they talk a good fight about there should be, in life outcomes, there should be no difference between the peasant tilling the land and the so-called intelligentsia in the factories or in the business or whatever, the factory worker or the business in business of some sort, teachers, doctors. Everyone should get more or less the same outcome, as everyone in a socialist sort of sense has equal value. And they talk about equality of outcome between the classes and eradicate classes. They also talk interesting things, this is in the Constitution, about equality between the country hick and the so-called sophisticated city slicker. That people in the country, people in the city look down their noses at people in the country, and the socialist revolution will eradicate that. That's an interesting sort of take. Why that would be a priority in a constitution is an interesting one. They also say, well, in the Soviet Union, as it was, by the way, in the Russian Empire, there are various different races, Asiatic races, Arabics, Muslims, white Christians, and so on. There are a whole different sort of range of people involved there, and they want to. Or the Constitution talks about that these races should be equal. This wasn't the case, though. The government was overwhelmingly made up of Russians and white people, and there was, in the senior political levels, there was no women and things like that. So this talk about equality was pretty hollow in that sense, but it sounded good from a socialist perspective of, theoretically at least, or ideologically, everyone's equal. Other things that the Soviet, and again, you see this in the Chinese and even the Cambodian attempts at what we might loosely call a constitution. The attempts to define equality in an ideological sense, and in the Soviet one, they say, well, as long as no one's financially exploiting anyone else, so an owner of a business or an owner of property charging rents, or someone owning land and subletting it out to a tenant farmer or something, as long as no one's financially exploiting anyone else, then technically everyone's equal because no one's being exploited. And that was very much central to their argument of what equality meant. Their definition of equality wasn't actually equality. Their definition of equality was that if you can't or you're not exploiting someone, then everyone is therefore equal. And that's, of course, a load of nonsense in reality. Now, the other thing that the Constitution talked about in terms of the supposed obligations, well, they weren't obligations, aspirations of government, was to say, well, the poorest people, and by the poorest they meant the people who were illiterate and peasants working on the land, that sort of thing, that the poorest people will eradicate the bottom class so that everyone's equal. Now, to do that, though, they dragged down the people at the top, so they were dragged down. The people in the middle were dragged down. So if you look at the people at the bottom, by the way, I believe did have an improved lifestyle, or not lifestyle, something more certain that they were all forced to have an education. They were brutally transplanted onto state-run communal farms. Millions died in that process, so that was hardly a benefit to the peasants. The better off peasants that were the expert agriculturalists were nearly all killed off in order to prevent, if you like, an upper class of peasant existing. So really, we're going. If you look at it on the scale of 100, and the people at the top are number 1, and people at the bottom are number 100. What the communists did, certainly in the Soviet Union, is they dragged down the people at the top and people at the middle, and even the people at the upper end of the bottom. They dragged them all down to from number 1 down to, say, 60. So they're all dragged, and then they dragged the people who were at the bottom, sort of around 100, they dragged them up to sort of 65, so that everyone existed sort of between the range of 60 to 70, and that was the equality. But to achieve that, again, tens of millions of people were killed. The economy was torn to pieces, and inefficient practices of all sorts were instituted in order to artificially force this equality. Now, so you'd have to say it was a failure of grand scale. But the idea was the people at the bottom have got a better deal. They've got regular employment, they've got a job, they've got a place to live in. It might be a shitty place, but they've got a place to live in, roof over their head, and they get food, or they don't starve. The food may be bland, or it maybe taste like shit, but they've got food, and they are getting by day to day. Whereas they would have had a much more uncertain existence, based on the weather and a whole range of factors, back in the day. There were differences. A peasant working on a farm would have physically had to go out and do the hard work, with an oxen or something like that. Whereas, the communists were very big on manufacturing things like tractors and other agricultural machinery, which would have made a difference. But again, moving them onto state farms. Now, they interestingly, the Soviets, but others too. Cambodia saw this as well. There were three sorts of work. There was, if you look at say manual labor, you're working on the farm, you're digging the ditches and whatever, working in the factory, stoking the boilers, and then there's mental work. People that were doing the central economic planners at the bureaucracy and those sorts of things, who were doing office work. And then they had another category, though, which was indirectly referenced, of ideological work, and this plays into what's happening today in the West. The ideological work was the one that paid the best and was considered the most high status. So if you were a teacher teaching communist revolution, you were considered to be a school teacher. This is, or even at college, you were considered to be an ideological worker, and thus of greater value to the socialist revolution than either mental or physical work. Now, there are other things that you saw scattered throughout the Soviet constitution that if you don't work, you won't eat. So they had very much placed value in everybody must work, everybody must consume, and everything must be centrally planned. This is very much the communist experience, and also a big part of why it fails and creates stunted growth, poverty, and so on. The common denominator is just lowered and lowered and lowered. Everybody's on that common denominator, or at least the mental and physical workers, not the ideological ones. Now, I met a if you like, a political science teacher, for want of a better word, from the old Soviet Union. Actually, I've met a few. But it was considered to be a high status job. You were teaching young people that the West was evil, and the Soviet, constitution and laws and the state were wonderful. Socialism was wonderful. There was the decadent West, where starving bodies lay on the street. A complete misrepresentation. But it relied very heavily on absolute lies and untruths and insane assertions that had no basis in reality. But if you could deliver that effectively, and your students believed you, and they liked you and looked up to you and respected you and believed the lies, then you were considered to be an ideological worker of the first rank, and you would get rewarded accordingly. These rewards in, for example, the Soviet Union were, you would have a better house to live in, whereas the proletariat, if you like, or the communist proletariat, would live in apartments where they shared the toilet with 4 other families. They shared a kitchen with 8 other families. The walls were so thin you could hear somebody breathing almost, and the elevators in the tall building were always breaking down. You had to go up and down the stairs. The people to service them never came. It was weeks the elevator would be out of operation. All sorts of things like that. But if you were the teacher teaching ideological fanaticism to the kids, then you would have your own apartment with your own kitchen and your own bathroom, and the elevators always worked, and you'd have access to vacation, holiday locations, vacation on the Black Sea coast, and they would be. You would have access to better shops, so you could buy a wider range of better quality food, whereas the others, the factory workers, had to queue for loaves of bread if there was a shortage of grain or something like that. You didn't have to queue. There were shops that had bread all the time, and you could buy stuff. So there was still a hierarchy. You didn't own things, but you'd access to a much better quality of life that otherwise would have been purchased through productive labour and working harder or whatever. So that they still had that same difference, access to Western movies that were dubbed in Russian and so on. You had access to all those things if you're an ideological worker. So it's interesting that three categories of work are physical, mental, and ideological. And we see that today in the West. The idea of people who are out to go on social media and shut down opinions that the government doesn't like, or to peddle lies and misinformation about COVID, or to say that illegal migrants who are illiterate peasants and illiterate in their own language are somehow really doctors and engineers. These sorts of things, and we're seeing it all over the West at the moment, or any country that's targeted by the globalists. So we're seeing this sort of misinformation and this propaganda deception. And these are the ideological workers. This is the equivalent here in the West today to the ideological workers in the Soviet Union. There were vast armies of these ideological workers. They used to send them around. So they did. The Russians used to have cruise ships that they used to go around the world. Some used to come to Australia. I can't think of the name off the top of my head of one, but they used to come. I think every year it would come in summertime and do a bit of a cruise around the Pacific Islands, and they would have staff on board who were professional propagandists. They were ideological workers, and they would because they would hire local people in Australia, singers and entertainers, dancers, or comedians, things like that. They would hire them in Australia through booking agencies, and they would hire them in Australia, and then they would then ply these people with. They would assign them interpreters, but they would to talk to the other employees. But really, these people weren't fucking interpreters at all. They were propagandists. So they would ply these people who were already very arty, singers and dancers. They're probably strongly left leaning anyway. And they think, do you know that half the population of the Soviet Union is former American Negroes? Did you know that? No, that's right. That they're escaping the evil, oppressive West, and they're coming to the Soviet Union where they're equal and free. Did you know that lesbians are in charge of half the country? Did you know that this and equality and so they tell them these most outrageous untruths about the Soviet Union, and that it was a wonderful place, a paradise, a fucking paradise. And then they would try to get these people to then repeat it. So I remember, I knew some of these people, or a buddy of mine, his sister's best friend or something. And so I was meeting. She said, "Oh, did you know? The evil fucking fascist white people, the oppressors. And did you know it's a paradise in Russia and the Soviet Union? It's a paradise, and there's millions, tens of hundreds of millions of black people there living a life of freedom." And of course, utter and total nonsense. But that was the propaganda they're putting around. We have that today in the West of propagandists that are being circulated and controlled and scripted by the globalists. Now, the thing about all these constitutions was that there was no rights for the protection of the individual. The individual was treated as almost an enemy in waiting. That the only true sort of communists were the people at the apex of government, and they were there to make sure no one stepped out of line, or no one sort of failed to toe the line. And this was a if you look at, say, the idea of you're innocent until proven guilty, or that there are laws or there are mechanisms to protect the rights of the individual. Not that these laws didn't exist, or they weren't. You could go to court and have the case heard by a judge. All these sorts of things that they existed, but the government was in no way obligated. The moment they said that the communist ideology or socialist ideology was either not being adhered to or being threatened in some way, and they could arbitrarily decide that, then there was no law to protect you, none. They had every right to do to you whatever they wanted to do to you, however they wanted to do it. So there were no actual protections for the citizen or the individual. The other thing that was interesting is that none of the government was not obligated to abide by the law itself. There was no requirement to do it. Excuse me. They could arbitrarily say, well, we're attempting to create an equal society, and whatever measures we take to achieve that, and we can decide whatever those measures should and shouldn't be at any given time. Whenever we're doing that, then we're not obligated to abide by the law. Now we see this with the globalists today. They want to implement the globalist project because it protects black, lesbians, and transgender people from harm. Therefore, they're allowed to do whatever they want to do, to arbitrarily arrest people. And we see this in, say, watching climate change protesters block roads, which is brazenly illegal, and there are plenty of laws on the books to where the police and the government and the prosecution departments and so on could go and arrest these people and put them in prison and fine them, all that sort of stuff. And there, people aren't hiding it. I mean, it's filmed and it's on camera. It's people who are committing these crimes where they are 100% caught dead to rights. So it would be a complicated case of proving guilt or something like that. But we find that not only are courts extremely unwilling to do anything, the Department of Prosecutions are unwilling. The police most of the time won't arrest them or even move them on. They even say, hey, you're breaking the law, and move on. The police won't even do that. But if a driver or someone on the street trying to drive along the street that they're entitled to do, if they get out of their car or their truck or van or something and try and move these protesters out of the way, the police swoop in instantly and arrest them or harass them or detain them. So we're seeing, in many ways, how the globalist-controlled governments are doing the same thing as the ideologically driven Soviets were. So everything was seen in ideological terms, as in communist socialist ideology. And they would wait for they would either create a situation or wait for it to occur. It would then receive an ideological interpretation, and then the state would act. So there was no law. The laws didn't govern the behaviour or direct the behaviour of the government. It was the ideological interpretation of things. And they accepted that, and it was in the Constitution as being quite a normal way of doing things. Ideologically, we can really do what we want, and if we have laws that tie us down, then we're prevented from acting in order to protect and further the ideology. This is very much the globalist view, that laws restrict us, and this is why the globalists are determined to bypass the law, whether it's through activist judges, whether it's through prosecutors deciding which laws they will and won't prosecute, these sorts of things. Here's another example. Just recently, a bunch of white parents were complaining outside, protesting outside the school, and about the LGBTQ propaganda that's being forced without anyone's consent, forced on the children, and this is children as young as 5-6 years old. and they were quite rightly protesting about it. The police were there and forced to move them on, harass them, intimidate them, and otherwise try and break it all up and disrupt it. So the forces of the state were being directly used against these people. Then a crowd of Muslims turns up and protests exactly the same thing. And yet the police are very hands-off. They just don't know what to do. So this idea of pitting racial groups, religious groups, and so on against each other is something that's very much part of the globalist project. And it was also the ideological project of these tyrannical communist regimes. They would claim there was a tension or a conflict that existed, a social conflict of some sort that required their intervention, the state intervention, to solve. And it invariably involved an ideological interpretation of upholding the communist ideal, not of actually applying the law or determining guilt or anything like that. We see this increasingly now. If people on social media say the most terrible things about white Christians, straight white Christians, then that's allowed. And the most the most terrible, grotesque untruths are peddled in this, and there's no social media thing to take those posts down or to condemn people for making those utterances. But if a straight white person makes that, an equivalent utterance, but against black people or whatever, brown people or whatever, then that's condemned as being Nazi and fascist, Hitler. So we're already in the throes of that ideological situation that the tyrannical communist regimes were. In the West, we're having that imposed slowly through nudge units and bit by bit and step by step, not through armed revolution. But I think ultimately the globalists want to take us, in effect, to the same place where a bunch of, it'll be capitalist this time, sit at the top, and there'll be a handful of them, and there'll be the Black Rocks and the McKinseys and whatever will be sitting at the apex, and they'll be doing what they want. They'll be eating the steaks and flying on jets, but the rest of the Western population will be reduced to the point of peasantry. Now, the problem with that is white people have developed, over the centuries, many centuries, in a what's considered to be a power sharing arrangement with the government. The government is of the people, by the people, for the people. So it's been very different from the Chinese model of government or any other form of government that's grown up through their culture and through their experiences over thousands of years. So the evolution of the Western government, which has created the richest countries in human history, that's what that's the glittering prize that the globalists want, and they can't achieve that, and they're not going to share power. They've got no interest in that. They can't achieve that without crushing white people or the people that assume that they're going to share power with those who govern them. And that's something the globalists will not accept under any circumstances, which is why white people have to be crushed, which is why it's possible to go and burn Christian churches and the government does nothing. Whereas if you leave a slice of bacon outside a mosque, then it's hundreds of police were involved in the check, and the person is going to be found, prosecuted, fucking Nazi. And this is the place we're in at the moment. But it's interesting to look at these constitutions and look at how the Soviet Union is an example, and how they perceive their role and their mission and their purpose, and how closely that aligns architecturally and in practical terms with the globalist approach today. You've been with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.